Hey guys, I thought that we would start reading Fahrenheit 451 together. So I'm going to read the first few pages, and again, if you have the book, you can follow along or you can use the PDF that's out on Google Classroom. So the first section, again, it's divided up into three sections, and the first section, I think it's 60-something pages. Let me double check on that. Might be a little bit longer. Yeah, there we go. It's 65 pages. Okay, and so that's what you guys will be reading this first week. And there's a study guide that goes along on Google Classroom, and then there will be a question posted out on a Padlet for you guys to answer and have some conversation. So make sure before you jump in and start reading, make sure that you have looked at, there's a video about dystopian literature and traits on it. So make sure that you have, you've watched that video. All right, so the first section is called The Hearth and the Salamander. And I want you guys in this opening section, y'all, there are these beautifully written metaphors. And there's actually quite a bit of symbolism in here. He talks about the autumn leaves. And so autumn or the seasons are very, very symbolic when it comes to literature. In the fall, think about, leaves are beginning to turn and then they fall off the tree. So it's kind of the beginning of this, if you will, this death process. And then when you get to winter and the trees are very, very barren. There's color imagery. Sorry, the cats were just hissing in the background again. This whole weird new norm, right? Anyway, so again, just be aware of the imagery. The opening paragraph, if you enjoy writing and doing creative writing, it might be fun to kind of come up with a subject of your own and see if you can mimic this writing style using all these beautiful metaphors. As a matter of fact, one of the questions on the study guide is, what's he trying to do with some of these metaphors? Identify two of them and then just kind of explain how does that affect the meaning, okay? So, Fahrenheit 451, The Hearth and the Salamander. It was a pleasure to burn. It was a special pleasure to see things eaten, to see things blackened and changed. With the brass nozzle in his fists, with this great python spitting its venomous kerosene upon the world, the blood pounded in his head, and his hands were the hands of some amazing conductor, playing all the symphonies of blazing and burning to bring down the tatters and charcoal ruins of history. With his symbolic helmet numbered 451 on his stolid head, and his eyes all orange flame with the thought of what came next, he flicked the igniter and the house jumped up in a gorging fire that burned the evening sky, red and yellow and black. He strode in a swarm of fireflies. He wanted, above all, like the old joke, to shove a marshmallow on a stick in the furnace while the flapping pigeon-winged books died on the porch and lawn of the house. While the books went up in sparkling whirls and blew away on a wind turned dark with burning. Montauk grinned the fierce grin of all men singed and driven back by flame. He knew that when he returned to the firehouse, he might wink at himself, a minstrel man burnt corked in the mirror. Later, going to sleep, he would feel the fiery smile still gripped by his face muscles in the dark. It never went away, that smile. It never, ever went away as long as he remembered. He hung up his black beetle-colored helmet and shined it. He hung his flame-proof jacket neatly. He showered luxuriously, and then, whistling, hands in pockets, walked across the upper floor of the fire station and fell down the hole. At the last moment, when disaster seemed positive, he pulled his hands from his pockets and broke his fall by grasping the golden pole. He slid to a squeaking halt, the heels 1 inch from the concrete floor downstairs. He walked out of the fire station and along the midnight street toward the subway, where the silent air-propelled train slid soundlessly down its lubricated flue in the earth and let him out with a great puff of warm air onto the cream-tiled escalator rising to the suburb. Whistling, he let the escalator waft him into the still night air. He walked toward the corner, thinking little at all about nothing in particular. Before he reached the corner, however, he slowed as if a wind had sprung up from nowhere, as if someone had called his name. The last few nights, he had had the most uncertain feelings about the sidewalk just around the corner here, moving in the starlight toward his house. He had felt that a moment prior to his making the turn, someone had been there. The air seemed charged with a special calm, as if someone had waited there quietly, and only a moment before he came, simply turned to a shadow and let him through. Perhaps his nose detected a faint perfume. Perhaps the skin on the backs of his hands, on his face, felt the temperature rise at this one spot where a person's standing might raise the immediate atmosphere 10 degrees for an instant. There was no understanding it. Each time he made the turn, he saw only the white, unused, buckling sidewalk, with perhaps on one night something vanishing swiftly across the lawn before he could focus his eyes or speak. But now tonight, he slowed almost to a stop. His inner mind, reaching out to turn the corner for him, had heard the faintest whisper. Breathing? Or was the atmosphere compressed merely by someone standing very quietly there, waiting? He turned the corner. The autumn leaves blew over the moonlit pavement in such a way as to make the girl who was moving there seem fixed to a sliding sidewalk, letting the motion of the wind and the leaves carry her forward. Her head was half bent to watch her shoes stir the circling leaves. Her face was slender and milk white, and in it was kind of a gentle hunger that touched over everything with tireless curiosity. It was a look almost of pale surprise. The dark eyes were so fixed to the world that no move escaped them. Her dress was white, and it whispered. He almost thought he heard the motion of her hands as she walked, and the infinitely small sound now, the white stir of her face turning when she discovered she was a moment away from a man who stood in the middle of the pavement, waiting. Guys, look at this color symbolism that's going on here. Think about what it symbolizes and how that would, any kind of traits might transfer onto the character, or any kind of impressions that it might give you of that impression before even meeting her. The fact that there's this particular color of white that it's already associating with this character. The leaves overhead made a great sound of letting down their dry rain. Leaves are falling. The girl stopped and looked as if she might pull back in surprise, but instead stood regarding Montague with eyes so dark and shining and alive that he felt he had something quite wonderful. He had said something quite wonderful, sorry. But he knew his mouth had only moved to say hello, and then when she seemed hypnotized by the salamander on his arm and the phoenix disc on his chest, he spoke again. Of course, he said. You're our new neighbor, aren't you? And you must be, she raised her eyes from his professional symbols, the fireman. Her voice trailed off. How oddly you say that. I'd have known it with my eyes shut, she said slowly. What, the smell of kerosene? My wife always complains, he laughed. You never wash it off completely. No, you don't, she said in awe. He felt she was walking in a circle about him, turning him end for end, shaking him quietly, and emptying his pockets without once moving herself. What does that even mean? Guys, think about that. Again, that imagery. So they're talking, and he feels like she's walking around him, turning him end for end. What does that mean? Shaking him quietly, emptying his pockets. So think about kind of what he's feeling with this interaction. Kerosene, he said, because the silence had lengthened, is nothing but perfume to me. Does it seem like that, really? Of course, why not? She gave herself time to think of it. I don't know. She turned to face the sidewalk, going toward their homes. Do you mind if I walk back with you? I'm Clarice McClellan. Clarice, Guy Montag. Come along. What are you doing out so late wandering around? How old are you? They walked in the warm, cool, blowing night on the silvered pavement, and there was the faintest breath of fresh apricots and strawberries in the air, and he looked around and realized this was quite impossible so late in the year. There was only the girl walking with him now, her face bright as snow in the moonlight, and he knew she was working his questions around, seeking the best answers she could possibly give. Well, she said, I'm 17 and I'm crazy. My uncle says the two always go together. When people ask your age, he said, always say 17 and insane. Isn't this a nice time of night to walk? I like to smell things and look at things and sometimes stay all night walking and watch the sunrise. They walked on again in silence, and finally she said thoughtfully, you know, I'm not afraid of you at all. He was surprised. Why should you be? So many people are afraid of firemen, I mean. But you're just a man, after all. What does that mean? You're just a man. There's nothing to be afraid of. You're just a man. He saw himself in her eyes, suspended in two shining drops of bright water. Himself dark and tiny, in fine detail, the lines about his mouth, everything there, as if her eyes were two miraculous bits of violet amber that might capture and hold him intact. Her face, turned to him now, was fragile milk crystal with a soft and constant light in it. It was not the hysterical light of electricity, but what? But the strangely comfortable and rare and gently flattering light of the candle. One time, as a child in a power failure, his mother had found and lit a last candle, and there had been a brief hour of rediscovery, of such illumination that space lost its vast dimension and drew comfortably around them, and they, mother and son, alone, transformed, hoping that the power might not come on again too soon. And then Clarice McClellan said, do you mind if I ask how long you've worked at being a fireman? Since I was 20, 10 years ago. Do you ever read any of the books you burn? He laughed. That's against the law. Oh, of course. It's fine work. Monday, burn Millet. Wednesday, Whitman. Friday, Faulkner. Burn 'em to ashes, then burn the ashes. That's our official slogan. They walked still further, and the girl said, is it true that long ago firemen put fires out instead of going to start them? No, houses have always been fireproof. Take my word for it. Strange. I heard once that a long time ago, houses used to burn by accident and they needed firemen to stop the flames. He laughed. She glanced quickly over. Why are you laughing? I don't know. He started to laugh again and stopped. Why? You laugh when I haven't been funny and you answer right off. You never stop to think what I've asked you. He stopped walking. You are an odd one, he said, looking at her. Haven't you any respect? Now this just occurred to me where she says, you never stop to think what I've asked you. Think about the traits of the dystopian literature, and one of the things was that independent thinking is very much frowned upon. And such, we're kind of beginning to see some of that here. She's saying I ask you questions and you either laugh or you just answer without really thinking about it, without really giving it any thought. Let's see. He stopped walking. You are an odd one, he said, looking at her. Haven't you any respect? I don't mean to be insulting. It's just I love to watch people too much, I guess. Well, doesn't this mean anything to you? He tapped the numerals 451 stitched on his char-colored sleeve. Yes, she whispered. She increased her pace. Have you ever watched the jet cars racing on the boulevards down that way? You're changing the subject. I sometimes think drivers don't know what grass is or flowers because they never see them slowly, she said. If you showed a driver a green blur, oh yes, he'd say, that's grass. A pink blur, that's a rose garden. Hang on. Excuse me. That's a rose garden. White blurs are houses. Brown blurs are cows. My uncle drove slowly on a highway once. He drove 40 miles an hour and they jailed him for 2 days. Isn't that funny? And sad, too. You think too many things, said Montauk uneasily. I rarely watch the parlor walls or go to races or fun parks, so I've had lots of time for crazy thoughts, I guess. Have you seen the 200-foot-long billboards in the country beyond town? Did you know that once billboards were only 20 feet long, but cars started rushing by so quickly they had to stretch the advertising out so it would last? As what is this telling you about that society? I didn't know that, Montauk laughed abruptly. But I know something else you didn't. There's dew on the grass in the morning. He suddenly couldn't remember if he had known this or not, and it made him quite irritable. And if you look, she nodded at the sky, there's a man in the moon. He hadn't looked for a long time. They walked the rest of the way in silence, hers thoughtful, his a kind of clenching and uncomfortable silence in which he shot her accusing glances. When they reached her house, all its lights were blazing. What's going on? Montauk had rarely seen that many house lights. Oh, just my mother and father and uncle sitting around talking. It's like being a pedestrian, only rarer. My uncle was arrested another time, did I tell you? For being a pedestrian. Oh, we're most peculiar. There is actually a Ray Bradbury short story called The Pedestrian, and it's basically this story here about someone being arrested for simply being a pedestrian. But what do you talk about? She laughed at this. Good night. She started up her walk. Then she seemed to remember something and came back to look at him with wonder and curiosity. Are you happy? She said. Am I what? He cried. But she was gone, running into the moonlight, her front door shut gently. So think about this. I mean, she is kind of representing this old school, take time to smell the roses, if you've heard that cliche. And that's apparently considered odd during this society. So look at the study guide and continue reading section 1, and we will come back and revisit this. Happy reading.